All right, and welcome back to another episode of opening up the floor and letting those different views that we're not so common to come in contact with take main stage. And we're again joined by James R. Brayshaw, who has already cracked the can of worms for us on investigating how should we be approaching Satan in the Bible. So we obviously couldn't go through the entire thing and the whole entire topic because Satan's such a large topic, considering that James also goes into demons and what that all means, historically, both for the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. So it's such a huge topic. He wrote 4 books, 4 full volumes on it, and we kind of opened that, but we didn't get into all the juicy, fun stuff, which is what we're going to do today, because everybody has their ideas. We all kind of come from a position of different ranges of how we perceive those. But at the end of the day, it seems like every group comes back to the same questions about, well, what about Samuel being raised? And what about these demons and pigs? So in the last episode, if you haven't seen it, I think it'd be really good to go and see what information was brought up, because it'll set the stage a little bit better for what we're getting into now, as opposed to if this is your first experience to hearing James speak, you might really get a misrepresentation where he's coming from, because we were jumping the river here kind of midstream a little bit. So do yourself a favor, pop back, take a look at that one, and then catch up here and see why we're discussing these things. And with all that being said, I just want to say, James, thank you again. This is a huge topic. I know you love talking about it, otherwise you wouldn't have written so much. So thank you so much for being here. Before we get going, if you could just let those who might not be so, again, familiar with you, let them know who you are, what you've written, and what, just a little bit about yourself. I'll give you
Absolutely
two
will.
minutes because we already did it once.
Happy to do that. Dallas, thanks for having me back. And I'm really privileged to talk about this topic. These two, double your fun. We get to go through Saul seeking the witch of Endor for counsel. And then when Jesus or Yeshua casts the demons into swine. And we'll spend our time together going through those. But my work has involved, as you mentioned, a very privileged position to start with. I am not a paid preacher, teacher in these topics. I'm not deeply trained in the magical arts of biblical institutes. But here's a comment by Upton Sinclair. My work, you might be able to see here, I was part of the fire service for several years, 29 years, and left that a couple of years ago as a fire captain. And in that time, I worked closely with people who always had questions, and we were trying to find answers. And it wasn't always about religious things. So I journeyed along, churned away at some questions that were posed to me about Satan, hell, demons, devils, the afterlife, angels, and heaven, who the Messiah was, what a covenant is, all these great things that your community and a lot of your listeners are going through all the time. But we know that Upton Sinclair said it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding. This is a brilliant statement. And before you started recording, we talked a bit about having people push away when you have a divergent view of something, pushing you away, or us repelling them because of our ardent, zealous view. But I found the hardest people to convince were those who are getting paid to deliver the message of Scripture as they've been taught by their institution or forebears. So the group we're talking to today, hopefully you're not being paid to hold to a view, because that's one layer we can lift out of the way to say, okay, I can start exploring. It's not about the destination. It's not about finding freedom. It's about finding the opening to explore freedom. And inside of that, it took me through the journey of writing one book that I realized couldn't be in one book. Each of these volumes I've written: Satan, Christianity's Other God, Imagine No Satan, Volume 2, Who's the Devil Jesus Knew. We're going to be looking at pieces from those two volumes, Volumes 2 and 3 today. And then the fourth volume takes us through Acts to Revelation, explaining about the Satan and hell and demons that we might see occurring in there. This is it, Satan is finished, culminating in how Satan looks at the end in the revelation of John as we go through that. So that's a piece or two about me. I did get some questions from your viewers as well by email asking about the Witch of Endor. And you mentioned it, Dallas, like what about, like that is one of the biggest, what about, tell me, is this not the case, Dallas, where you've shared some of your concepts that you understand to be accurate in the biblical messaging, and people say, well, what about something?
Absolutely. There's one video I love to share with this gentleman on YouTube who goes through every occurrence of the word demon and that in the Old Testament, and it shows up pretty interesting, perspective, all these kind of things, and you present that to people. And I've done my own video exploring what the word Satan means in the Bible and presented that, and it is ultimately comes back down to these two ideas that, I'm so thankful that you've had time to dig into and explore, which is, well, what about Samuel being raised up, and what about these, swine, these demons going in the swine? So there's no doubt that I think that these two are probably the most important. They're the most interesting to me personally because
Yeah,
I've never come to a point of personal resolution to the witch. I just, it's yeah, I am too much of, I was raised with watching fairy tales and witches raise people from the dead to be able to break my mind out of that mold. So can't wait to see what you have to say about that. While when I look forward to also, because I've already cheated and had some of your data presented to me about the idea of the swine, and I think you've got a really good idea with it. So I'm excited both because I'm personally involved in it. I think those two are, even for me, the two most interesting conversations around this topic of demons and Satan. So not only for the crowd I'm talking to, but yeah, even me, I'm right there
yeah.
with them.
Well, you and I we're lifetime learners in this now, and whether we want it to be or not, that's how we are. And to go back to these topics really reaffirms, okay, yeah, that does make sense that way, because the way our brains work is the first truth we're taught is usually the one that sticks, as you know. And so that neural mapping pathway that gets developed when we get these early childhood images, stories, they are the hardest things for us to unpack. And that is, I'm not going to mince words, that's often seen as cultic inculcating of ideology to people. And it's really hard to deprogram ourselves. So thank you for giving me a chance to share, because every time I learn from the stuff you and I have talked about, I get a little more deprogrammed. And well, what about Dallas, the Witch of Endor? Like we know the story, and I'm not. Here's what's beautiful about this work is we can't understand the Witch of Endor's the raising of Samuel the prophet when Saul came to her in secret in some kind of a costume, and uh, we can't understand that story unless we understand a few things along with it. Like if I believe,
Well, I'm just going to throw this out for people before you get into this. Is if you're unfamiliar with what James is about to enter into, it's First Samuel 28, and without any, I'm ready. Let's hear it. It's all yours. The floor is yours. Let's do
thank you,
this.
yeah, yeah, and if you turn that, we're going to look at the scriptures along the way, and I'm going to talk about how that can be seen as not the traditional view. But we need to start with just reminding ourselves, where do the dead go? Traditionally, we think the dead either go to heaven or hell. There's a concept in some ancient religious theology that says there's a limbo or a purgatory or an Elysium. There's many, many ideas of where the dead go. And the word Sheol is the pit, the dark covered grave. If we look at that word, and Sheol is really the parent word for Gehenna, Hades, Tartarus, and hell. And all those things mean the same thing to the original speakers of the word Sheol. So it never meant an ethereal or some level of conscious afterlife where there is either great joy and excitement for eternity or great suffering and torment for eternity. So where we're saying in this is people go, and if we look closely at the language, people go to the grave, the dead, under the earth, non-conscious, as we'll see. And what happened is the Greco-Roman themes that were inherited from the Babylonian and Persian and Akkadian and all the previous Egyptian religions, the Greco-Roman and Gnosticism versions and Christian versions all have a history where they developed the doctrine of the immortal soul. So the Hebrew people themselves didn't ascribe to this immortal soul concept until what happened? Syncretism. It's called syncretism for those of you who may not have heard that word. It's where we enter a new culture and we blend our theories and philosophies of spiritual things, and they become basically new ideologies or ideas or concepts. And here's one, for instance, that maybe isn't so blended into our cultures today. It's called the lowest hell. Here, I'll just give you a picture of some of the passages where that occurs so we can understand what that is. Many of us have explored hell. But there's a concept we see in it would have been the pre-Saul era, and it came from ancient Mesopotamia, and it was called the lowest hell. And here's one example of it. For fires kindled in my anger and shall burn unto the lowest hell and consume the earth. Jumping through to another one, the Psalm 88:6. Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit. And that's another reference to this darkness in the deeps. On the bottom, my substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. What are these references to? The beautiful thing about this is we can find out what they are when we look at this ancient Mesopotamian view of the afterlife. It used to be this case, Dallas, if you were my grandfather, and I know that's not even close to the truth, but I'm going to say it anyways. And you were a great dude in your grandfather, your father, your human life. You were wealthy, you owned land and property, and you died. It was believed that you would not go to the lowest hell. You would go to the upper Sheol. And this is where the fathers were known to rest in that. And that Mesopotamian version passed on through to Persia and Babylon as well. And what that meant is when I brought you treats and snacks and flowers and set them at your grave, your burial site, culture believed you would be able to get those and have some sense of comfort and peace in that upper Sheol.
To not take you off track, that pops the image into my head in the New Testament about that story of Abraham's bosom. Is that in that same vein of thinking? Am I hearing that right? Or would that be something different?
That is exactly what that vein of thinking is inside. And that's why the story came, because the mythopoetic version of articulating messaging in the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah, the renewed covenant or refreshed covenant, if you'll call it that, even called the apostolic writings, was to have it framed within the ancient ideas that had passed into the present day culture of that writing. And when people are in the lowest Sheol, so you were comfortable, though. And the difference here, though, is in the lowest pit, it was often seen as an abyss that was very cold, uncomfortable. You could never find comfort again. There was no active reward for those people who went down to that, descended to the lowest hell. And quite honestly, this is a very important thing to know. So the Mesopotamian view has passed through that. No, there's some version of suffering, but some version of insulating one with good things if they are a good people. If you were a scoundrel as a grandfather and a human, and then you died, we wouldn't, if we brought things to your gravesite, you couldn't get to them because you were in the lowest hell. You were under the earth. And the word Sheol speaks to that, just being buried under the earth. So when people were dead, there was a problem. I mentioned this in that first workshop, first work we did together a few weeks back on your podcast. So through Mesopotamia, Persia, Greece, Rome, and Christendom, we see that in a quest to establish that life doesn't end once it dies, God forbid, the ancient peoples purported the myth of the immortal soul concept. And what it did is it gave us comfort. Anybody here, born a human baby, you always want comfort. People want comfort. We want to know that our relatives aren't suffering when they're dead. So the ancients took comfort in the idea that their king, their father, their husband, or child, for instance, they weren't really gone. They were just merely gone from the physicality of their body, and they were in a lower place right now. And in this work we're going to go through today, I'm going to try not to overload with text, but there will be some on most of our screens to help us get a piece of the few of these pieces. Then when your listeners go back and watch or listen to the podcast, they might want to view the video segments to get the words. So putting another piece in, remember that I said at the start, team, that there's layers of insight we need to understand that come from extra biblical material so that we can understand the biblical material. And here's one of them, the word nefesh. Go ahead, Dallas.
Okay, I was just going to say, that's a really big point, that we have to be aware of the surrounding cultures. It's just a simple matter of fact that if we want to believe the Bible has an accurate story of any sort, we cannot forget that the narrative, the basic generic narrative of the Bible, has the creation of Adam and the people of Adam, and then from Adam, that whole people was wiped away. However, the next people, Noah, they populated all of Sumer. They married into Mesopotamia, and
Thanks.
all their children would have a variant of each other's views. They were a family. So I don't think it's outlandish for us to, first of all, we would have to, in order to understand the relations, look at them. Second of all, see the interesting relations. But third of all, I think we need to separate those relations to see how the Bible internally deals with them, because we don't want to take, because I don't know about you, but if someone 2,000 years or 3,000 years from now looked back and said, "Look, Mormons and Catholics and and Protestants are all exactly the same because they
Yeah.
all read the same book, they all spoke the same language, they all said the same thing." But we know it's more than that. So I think it's more than exceptional that you're looking at these things, because if we exclude those, we're actually denying the very basic narrative that these cultures created each other.
Hmm.
Abraham was pulled out of Ur, and his parents worshiped false gods, is what the Bible says.
That's
So
right.
he brought, just as you're saying, that culture that existed outside literally into the foundation of the people who wrote the Bible. So, no, I'm right there with you. And I think it's not only a valid point, it's an extremely necessary point.
And what you say just is so helpful for me because it's another fascinating example. And we've talked about this before. When we have a conversation, we always incite another path of thought to come out related to helping us understand and share the message. And that is really nice to hear the way you put it, because now you've added to me again, Dallas, because I will often say that the work I've done, how do you know that Satan's not Satan, but just a human adversary? Well, I say it's based on the historical, cultural, religious, social uh, um, context. Those four things, and literary context. Those five things. But now I'm going to add relational to that: historical, social, literary, religious. And now I've mixed up my words, but relational context is so important because, yeah, the closer we are to building family, we're likely going to bring some of those forward towards us. And
Uh,
in
oh, sorry, go ahead. I thought you were finished your idea there.
Yeah, I was just going to step into that piece on screen. You go ahead. I was finished.
I was just going to throw in, just for fun, here's a really interesting example to, take with yourself and kind of think about it for listeners. I think I've mentioned this to you, but when we take a look at the arrival of Jesus, he's described as 42 generations. Then Jesus comes. It's also interesting, it's 42 months in which the evil city is trampled upon. So it's
Right.
very interesting, this 42, this 42. Well, when we take a look back at where did these people come from? Well, they came out of Egypt. Well, Moses led these people literally out of Egypt. Well, if we go back into Egypt, they have this idea of the righteous God Ma'at. And Ma'at has, in order to obtain pure and perfect righteousness, you must live up to the 42 rules of Ma'at. Isn't that interesting that these people who came out of Egypt some 1,500 years later expected the 42 generations to bring perfect righteousness in?
What a connection. And they carried that 42 with them because it was a piece of the lore, the history, the culture that was orally transmitted through the lines. And sadly, we see things orally transmitted and then the shift because of oral transmission, such as the immortal soul doctrine developed in an ancient pagan culture, if we can call it that for now, versus seeing it uh, brought forward in correct terminology, and it and shifted the immortal soul doctrine, and also things like language. When we see the word nefesh in the Hebrew, what was the Ugaritic language or the terms that were used in ancient Sumeria or Acadia? Was it nefesh? And I doubt it was the same language as the Hebrew or Paleo Hebrew language. But the word nefesh is translated soul in the Old Testament, and we know that word now. If we look at the etymology and the history of it, it just means a breathing creature. It doesn't mean a third part of my being that has no physical form. Even Vine's complete expository dictionary defines nefesh as the essence of life. Soul is the essence of life. It's the act of breathing. And God created man and breathed into man, and man became a living nefesh, a living soul. We see the word in the New Testament, suke, is built off the word nefesh. And we see that when humans and animals died, both are considered, they go to the same place because they are a nefesh. They're just a breathing entity. And suke, as we see here, also refers to human breathing, living entities or souls. For animals, it's translated as life sometimes in the King James, but this is where religious scribes, leaders that were impacted by other cultures started to shift as they started to say, okay, the word must mean humans have this special part of their being that lives beyond their physicality, and animals don't. But most Hebrew scholarship will show you that neither of us have this spiritual part of our composite being that lives beyond the human physicality. So my question for y'all team is, do you have a suke, a nefesh, a soul, or are you a suke, a nefesh, a soul? We are. God breathed into man in that first starting of the Edenic covenant that we see in Genesis, and man became a nefesh. So we are a breathing, living entity, animated by, it's the animating force. And then we're also told in First Timothy, like I used to think, Dallas, that I have this immortality component to me, and I do have some belief there may be a resurrection. I'm not going to go into my whole understanding of that now. In some future time, perhaps, I'm still exploring what my complete decision is. It doesn't matter for right now, but we do see First Timothy talking about us, who's the only one that has immortality, dwelling in the light which no man can approach unto, whom no man hath seen nor can see, to whom be honor and power everlasting. Timothy was clear about the Old Testament understanding that there's only one entity considered to be immortal. It's not you, it's not me, it's not Jesus, it's not the apostles, it's not the Pope. Everybody else goes to hell, which we know that word hell means we die and we're under the earth. And I'm not going to belabor that because I just want to layer in these pieces that show us what we're about to see with Samuel and Saul and the witch of Endor. Ecclesiastes helps us to understand the living don't know that they're going to die. The living know they will die, but the dead don't know anything. Neither do they have any more reward, for they don't have any memory anymore. There's memory of them is forgotten. It doesn't mean we don't remember them, because we know that's not the case. Even Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah, talked about dead people that he remembered. So it's referring that there's no more memory in a dead person because it's gone. The soul, the breath is gone. On the bottom, we see, whatsoever your hand finds to do, do it with might, for there's no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom. In where? In the Sheol, in the grave, under the earth, when I'm dead, where I go. So where do the dead go? Well, they go to a place of nothing until such a time that if you believe there's a divine creator who has the power to resurrect or restore life, like originally designing life from the dust we came, and from the dust we shall return. But the point being, knowing there's no spirit entity that can be moved about in the cosmos and universe, under the earth or above the clouds. But I tell you, that's starting to lead into our next piece that's going to be layered in about what psychics are. Dallas, I want to pause here and see if you have an add-in or question to put a piece or two together for your audience.
I'm just listening to your presentation. I'm really enjoying it. That whole idea of the nefesh and that proper translation of the soul, and how we want to take a look at that and how it combines with the descriptions of the people around it. I'm just making a personal mental note that I'm going to come back and steal some of your notes because I need to add those to a different lesson that I'm using. So just like you, yeah, I might be saying things that are helping you see a little bit differently because you haven't heard those comments. You just said something that I've heard 100 times, but in a way that now I have conceptualized it different. Now I have to go deal with it. So as far as this stuff, I'm going along with the adventure. I'm right there with you, and I understand where we're going so far. I want to see what you're about to do with this next idea. I don't think it's been confusing, and as far as the rest of it, I'm just ready for your next go.
Well, maybe we should stop now because we're ahead.
We finally got it right. We're all done.
So, okay, the next piece, thank you for that, Dallas. The next piece is an interesting element in the 70s. And you all remember the Cold War. My kids had to teach me the Cold War was a Cold War because there was no bombs shot. It was mostly about information and knowledge between Russia and the States. And there was a project started by the CIA called Project Stargate. Maybe some of your listeners or viewers had heard of it. And it's the CIA's files on psychic spying. So what happened was the Russians started a program and they were able to change your mind, Dallas, from Russia through remote viewing technology, or find out information about about America's military efforts by remote viewing and remote writing, where they'd sit in rooms, they were sequestered, they'd have a pen and a pad on a steel. Well, you can imagine what a Russian room with a one desk, one pad, and one pen looks like. Nothing against Russian rooms, but people they would write down what they were seeing, and it was then thought to be that's what America's doing. We now can act on it. But this Project Stargate had some interesting demise in the
Before
70s.
you go way too into it, I'm just going to throw this for the audience. If you're not familiar with what James is getting into, go and watch the movie Men Who Stare at Goats. They kind of get into this concept too there. So yeah, just for maybe to spark some ideas, that's what this is doing for me. It's like, oh, that's what I'm hearing. Is that kind of along that same lines?
Exactly along that same line.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
thanks. I don't want to rewatch that one now that you mention it, Dallas. So then, of course, what happens in America? Well, if we know Russia's building satellites or nukes or special guns, we do satellites and nukes and special guns. If we know Russia's doing some kind of psychic spying, we start as well. And I'm not American. I just say we because I'm human. The CIA had carried out research into remote viewing from the early 70s, but eventually they determined it was not promising and they dropped it. It was codenamed Stargate, as we said. And the concerns, there was a psychic gap. So it was research into realizing, no, this kind of psychic capacity doesn't exist for humans. David Christensen of the CIA, he said there's no further US research into remote viewing warranted. And he added, we think the intelligence community shouldn't pursue it. Let's leave it to the private sector. And that's where Madame Bledsoe came out of, and Dionne Warwick's Psychic Network. So this is one huge hit the psychic belief took when people like the CIA are stopping it because there's no longer a psychic gap in knowledge. But they're not. And back up a bit. Everybody remembers Harry Houdini. I tell you, team, if you are interested to learn a bit more about psychic practice and behaviors, how to identify that they don't, in fact, have an impetus, power, any real phenomenological force to them. A Magician Among the Spirits is written by Harry Houdini. He wrote it before he died. He had this intense desire to find out if the afterlife existed the way common social themes identified it to exist. And he was exploring for 30 years, visiting psychics and mediums and seances. And in fact, I forget the name of his best buddy right now. It may come to me, who is quite the scientist himself. He tried to tell Houdini, "No, you're supernatural, buddy. Look at the magic you're doing. You are supernatural." But Houdini proved every one of them to be wrong, fallible, not actually psychic. They didn't exist. In fact, he went to his grave constructing a false language with his mother and his wife, saying, "Okay, when I come back, these are our words we're going to use. So if I can come back in the spirit, we're going to talk in these words, and you'll know it's these coded messages. You'll know it's me." None of them were ever able to affirm it, that it was accurate. Dallas.
I just want to add one more example if you're interested in pursuing out what James is saying, because we might, depending on our age, might not be so familiar with Harry Houdini, but you should definitely look at that. Also, go and check out the life of James Randi, who spent his whole life searching out. He even started an entire TV show and has on the books an offer of $1 million for anyone to prove their psychic ability. And he did it for some years. I'm not sure if he's still alive, but he became famous as the one that no one was ever able to prove anything. And it's not to sit here and say, you need to believe this or you need to believe that. But what I'm saying is, I understand where James is coming from in this because I've looked into it. I really wanted to know, and nowhere can I find anywhere except in stories and hearsays and, you know, I thinks. There's never any been proof for a spiritual or entity type spiritual connection. So just to throw that out there to add to the pile that James is saying, the names was James Randi.
Yeah.
And you can YouTube him, and you'll see a ton of stuff where he like you were explaining, James. He goes right on TV. He goes on to Johnny Carson and preps them to expose these fake guys saying they have these powers and stuff. So it's a very interesting character. And I don't know if you have him in your repertoire, but for somebody to add to Harry Houdini, that's exactly because James Randi was a professional magician as well. So
Yeah,
uh,
it's the James Randi $1 million challenge, and he ceased that $1 million challenge in the late '90s, and he died, I think, 3 years ago. I do write about him in that volume 3. In fact, this content we're talking about in Saul and the Witch of Endor is from volume 2. Imagine There's No Satan, and it's actually there's 3 chapters that we'd ask your readers, your listeners, to read: chapter 2, 3, and 4 in there, that talk all about the things that we're just addressing briefly. Thanks for
well,
bringing
that's
Randy.
fantastic. No, that's great that you bring him up too, because yeah, he was a big influence on part of my searching.
Well, and let's lean on him then a bit to talk about this cold reading, Dallas, because you're right. There's a big age disparity, and even James Randi's too old for some people that may be listening to explore it. And we find there's another Darren Brown, a UK magician, a mentalist is what he is, who also debunks a lot of this type of content. But what is cold reading? And Randy is familiar with it. James Randi, you're familiar with it. Houdini was familiar with it. There's a neighborhood psychic in every community that does this art of cold reading. We no longer see psychics as having some type of supernatural capacity, but cold reading is just a technique used. Some of them do it naturally. Some of them build it to learn it, to exploit and act fraudulently towards people. But it's used by interrogators, salespeople, hypnotists, psychics, psychologists. You see the list there, and others, to convince people that they know more about them than they actually do. And if we look at the ancient magic of Egypt, Joseph Ennemoser, I mentioned his books in the last time we spent together, talks about the use of this kind of knowledge grabbing by people who were cold readers way back in Egypt. So even without prior knowledge of you or me or the person, the cold reader can just gain a great deal of information by carefully analyzing the person's clothing, fashion, their hairstyle. And many of them do it subconsciously. It's not they're consciously, now I'm going to look at Dallas's shirt, and what is Dallas's shirt telling me about Dallas's grandparents that are dead? It's not, it's subconscious for the really high quality cold reader psychics or mediums, including things as gender and religion, of race, where they live, their geography, what their role is in society. And it's called profiling. They're doing this so that they can get you to believe what they're saying, so they can dupe us. And what I've learned is Saul got duped by a psychic, a cold reading, contemporary neighborhood psychic. It's a beautiful thing to uncover when we find that psychics are simply people with a familiar spirit. I'll give you the answer right out of the gate that I've understood it to be. The word familiar spirit in the scriptures, the Old Testament, we see one occurrence of it where it's taken from the same language in Acts 16. The Pythoness is what it's spoken of when Paul's dealing with a young lady who's chasing him around. Hey, you know the Most High God, you know the Most High God. And Paul says, hey, stop. But Saul and Paul, both, Saul maybe didn't understand what an obe was, one with a familiar spirit. Paul did, I believe. Now look at the passages here that reference the term. Leviticus 19, regard not them that have obe, a familiar spirit, neither seek after reward wizards to be defiled by them. I am Yahweh your God, meaning don't seek after people to get info. I'm Yahweh, come to me. And the next one, a soul that turns after such as have familiar spirits. Again, the word is obe. And after wizards to go whoring after them. I'm going to set my face against that soul. I'm going to cut him off from among his people. The last one there that I'll let you know about is a man or a woman that has a familiar spirit or is a wizard shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones, and their blood shall be upon them. So Saul knew familiar spirits were bad. Obe. But let's look at what John Gill says about the obe. We can uncover not so much contemporary theologians or theophilosophical individuals, but in historical theologians, we see them look at the word obe and determine what it meant based on the ancient historical, and literary context. The word used signifies bottles, and whatever that means to us today, it's hard to picture. And if you ever talked into a bottle, I just have a cup here, and now Dallas, I love the color of your shirt. Okay, that came from over there. So it's that idea of it sounds like something hollow, and not that it's coming from me. So that's what they're trying to indicate here. So these sort of diviners here intended to go by this name of Ob, and because what they sat on when they divined was in the form of a bottle, that could have been, or they divined by one when they delivered their answers, or spoke out of some type of a hollow bottle. So they were called masters or mistresses of the bottle, and they were the same as ventriloquists, someone able to cast their voice to a different spot.
So I'm hearing a lot of what I see on TV with these people who, for some reason, you know, they go into a trance and they channel a familiar spirit. Your dad. They do all that weird stuff.
Yeah,
They're changing their voice. So this is my normal voice, and they're oh, and then they talk in that. And they
yeah.
get this picture of this kind of show. That's what I'm hearing you say. Is that kind of what you're drawing?
That's exactly what I'm drawing. A nice picture, and I love that your Ob voice is coming out, Dallas, because if I can do it with theatrics, drama, and emotion, what happens to our brain when we have the power of suggestion in front of us is we have a more inclination to shut off our prefrontal cortex. We're not doing it intentionally, so we're not making those concrete decisions about the incidents or experience. We're making emotional decisions based on our aspiration to hear or see or feel something that's going to give us that comfort.
And that really lends to why, and this is where I think we got to give this some serious contemplation because this has become mainstream television. You know,
Yeah,
presidents, prime ministers, they make references to these things. So
true.
if they're believing in them, if they're making their choices, if we're voting on our choices, if we're going outside and walking in the world with people who are making the choices based upon information given to them by people, your dad says hi. That's a very interesting and important thing for us to consider because if we go back in time, we see the reality of how powerful it affects our culture. So I'm starting to hear how there is a possibility of how, if we just go back in time, this could be the exact same human difficulty trickster system. It's not necessarily a long shot what I'm hearing anymore. That example has made it normalized to me.
Sure has made it normalized. And Nancy and Ronald Reagan were well known for consulting with mediums and psychics to make decisions that the president needed to make. I document some of that in this volume as well.
That's interesting too, because we get big, giant political slash religious movements with Helena Blavatsky, Alice Bailey, and it's all derived 100% on receiving information from mediums and uh, ascended masters. So that's literally two names that came right out of that list you had just shared with us. So I also find that quite interesting.
Yeah, like if we have a big decision to make and it's just you and me, Dallas, and we're just in our houses and we don't run the world, it's not a big deal. We can just mull about it, talk to our partners and maybe our best buddy, talk to each other about it. But if we have a big decision to make and we're running the world or a kingdom, we want to get some concrete info that's going to help us stay in power. So we're going to be opening ourselves up to huge suggestibility. And John Gill speaks further on it regarding Acts 16. Um, the Ob, I'm starting halfway down, that is referenced in Acts 16 is the Pythoness, the young lady, which we render familiar spirit. It's the same version of a thing. The Septuagint uses engastrimythos as the word, and that's the word for ventriloquist today.
Oh,
They,
wow. So it just says it point blank there.
yeah, I'll go back there. Sorry. Yeah, says it point blank there when we see those terms in the Septuagint. And it's about people who pretend to predict future events. I'd love to know the future events, particularly if I'm leading a kingdom that's about to fall to the Philistines. This is setup. This is our setup. Now, team, we're getting into what got Saul to go check into the witch and get clandestine information that's going to keep him going forward with his power. So I'm worried. Saul, let's pick Saul. He's the one we're talking about here. He's quite worried that, you know what, the Philistines are about to crush him. He recently disobeyed the word of Yahweh, the Lord, when he went against the Amalekites, and he brought home the king, and he was supposed to kill everyone. And he went against the prophet Samuel, and now David's mounting up with military. The Philistines are looking like they're going to pound him. And then 1 Samuel 28:5-6 says, and when Saul saw the host of the Philistines, tell me, do you feel Saul's emotion here, folks? He was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. Like, that is such a mass. He had a massive army. Was opposed by a huge, huge threat to his kingdom. And when he inquired of Yahweh, the Lord didn't even answer him, not even by the breastplate items, the Urim and Thummim. So this is the setup. This is what you do now. If you're a king of that period and you don't have your prophet, your wise person, sorting out the times for you, telling you what to do next, you've relied on that person. Well, then what you do is, hey, I'm going to get my servants like Saul does. Hey, can you guys seek me a woman that's going to have an obe? So I can go talk to her? His servant said, well, there's a woman over in Endor. So smart Saul. Remember, Saul was pretty tall. He was a big, big dude. I don't know if he had girth as well as height. I never saw a Polaroid of him in real life. But he decided to disguise himself.
Hey, don't worry. Next weekend, I'll send you when we were hanging out, right? No.
Appreciate that. Yeah, just text it to me, Dallas. So he figured, I better disguise myself because I've got to go see this illegal person, the neighborhood witch, because he's already outlawed all the witches, because you're not allowed to have that in his kingdom. So he put on a different garment. 2 men went with him, and they went to the woman at night and said, hey, I'm going to ask you to divine to me by the obe. Bring him up for me, the person that I'm going to name to you. All right. So he's set up. He's ready. He's asking for her to do something.
Oh my goodness. What we're watching is that person who just lost their husband go down into that district and into that different cultural area, and they go and sit down at the faith healer, spiritual person, and say, here's $500. Will you please reconnect me with my loved one?
You are right. It's 100%.
Oh, wow. I can see that clearly. Keep going. This is great. Thank you so much, James.
And there's no more emotional potency in the human condition than missing a loved one who we need to hear from, because it becomes a need. Our brain, I need to pause and say what our brain is doing. The grieving brain needs a connection with that person because the entire neural map has everything connected to them. If I were to lose my closest person who I love forever, and I look outside and that's her car, instantly my brain connects her to the car, and I now have suffering. But all the things cause suffering. And so Saul, this reference you make, Dallas, is exactly that. People are ready. They're primed. And guess what? As a proper psychic, I'll be able to give you that comfort and take your money. And the woman, so she did this very thing. She said, hey, Saul said, we got to cut off those that have familiar spirits and get out the wizards out of the land. Why do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die? So do we think for a minute, this woman wasn't familiar with the Philistines, wasn't familiar with Saul's buddy and prophet Samuel dying, wasn't familiar with Saul breaking the rules of Yahweh when he went against the Amalekites. This lady was connected to society. Most psychics are more tuned in with society rather than less. And she knew everything about Saul. They always know everything about the leaders because they watch them. They need to take a temperature of the culture continually so they can ply their trade well. Hey, Dallas, I just want to pause here and ask you one thing. I know your audience doesn't have a chance. So I'm glad that you're with me on this. We are going to cover 2 topics if we have time. If we don't have time, I'm not trying to secure another seat in my chair with you. But
I'll be more than happy to come back more. This is going great.
Okay, so if we get to the end of this and it looks like we don't have sufficient time to cover the demons cast into swine,
I think we are going to have to push it forward because we are hitting right now 45 minutes in.
Gotcha. Oh my goodness, who's been talking so much?
Fast. Oh, it's great. It's been great. I love it.
Okay, well then I won't rush it to try to just accomplish the content. I want to make sure and get to where we need, and then we'll plan Folks, my apologies. Dallas and I had the hope to give this double the fun, but we will get back to you with when Jesus cast the demons into the swine, so we can also deal with that in a thorough manner.
Well, I'd rather come away with a much more clear understanding of one topic than two confused topics. So this was much more profitable, in my opinion, anyway.
Okay,
I
perfect.
will say that the image you're drawing makes a lot of sense. Like it really does from a natural point of view. All of a sudden, because that's why people do set it up. They're looking for those people who prime themselves, who come with money in hand, baiting them. Like they've already made the purchase for their feelings before they leave
Right.
the house. So all they're looking for is someone who wants to take their money and go along with the imagination they created. So I'm right there with you, and I think this is a really good way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's like, we have two cats, and when I see them engaging in a little cat battle, they roll around and they feed each other to the next move. That's what happens with people like us who go to a psychic or medium with money in hand, a deep desire to hear from my grandma. And the psychic has a deep desire to take my money and get me to come back. So she wants to give me comfort. I'm primed for comfort. She's primed to give me the comfort I need, or he. I keep saying she. I'm sorry to be such a misogynist. In this case, the witch of Endor was a female.
But the narrative we see with Saul really comes out in the same way. Here, he's at the greatest part of his stress as the leader. God has rejected him. His people are unsure with his leadership. The nations are coming against him. He reaches out to God and hears nothing. He's got nothing left except to go to the illegals. So it
Except
makes logical sense.
Yeah, and she would pretend she's not recognizing him. And when you mentioned stress, Dallas, thanks for mentioning that. Because one little highlight on stress that we know, and stress has affected human brains the same way for all time. Stress causes glucocorticoid hormones to release that cause cognitive deficit instantly. Oh, where did I put my keys? I got to go. I'm going to be late. I can't remember my keys. This is a little smaller than what Saul was going through, but he's not able to make rational decisions anyway because it's only emotion that's firing for Saul right now. So the woman just said, "Are you trying to cause me to die by making me psychic you, obe you?" And so then he says, "No, I promise you won't die." So she knew it was him. He knew, she knew. This is very logical. He knew, she knew it was him, but they just played their reciprocal cat battle, cat wrestling game where they're feeding each other back and forth. So here's some really important elements to pick up out
Yeah,
of this.
she was just being safe there as I'm reading this scripture. She's just like, "Ooh, is this you gonna trick me here, King? You looking for someone to martyr? No, no, seriously. Oh, okay, then let's do it." Kind of, right? It's that whole she had to pretend. She
Yeah.
had to, otherwise she could have just been set up.
Yeah, there used to be a law in North America where if I'm a drug dealer and you're a cop that's undercover and you come to me to buy drugs and I say, "Are you a cop?" You have to say, "Yeah, I'm a cop." But they changed that law 15, 20 years ago, who knows when, and you can lie to me now. No, I'm not a cop. And so then I would say, "Okay, you're not a cop. Okay, let's go ahead with this drug deal." This is the same thing. "Okay, I'm safe. Let's go ahead with this psychic deal." So the woman then said, "Okay." Saul told her what he wanted, and she knew he wanted to see his prophet. So the woman saw Samuel. She starts her. I could get you to go back into your psychic um, acting, Dallas, because that was pretty good. So the woman's doing she's doing her psychic acting, and she spoke to Saul, saying, "Why did you deceive me?" So she knows Saul. She's pretending now. Oh, the powers of spirit knowing let me know you're Saul, because she's just so smart. These are smart, tuned in people. Um, they're firing on all levels, and it's a version of psychological entrainment where she's using her own abilities of psychology and feeling his feelings, but still using hers to give the comfort that that person needs. But now she says, "Hey, you deceived me." And the king said, "Don't be afraid. For what
Oh,
did you see?"
interesting. I'm sorry. I'm just reading as you're saying that. I'm like, man, it's like watching an episode of Maury or whatever the shows on that. Because like here, she said, "There's guys rising up from the earth," and then it was Saul himself who's brought up that it was Samuel, and she picked it up and ran with it.
Yeah,
That's the same thing as someone coming out in front of the whole crowd. I'm getting like a Timothy. Is there a Timothy? My uncle's Timothy. You're the one that I'm talking to then. It's totally the same thing.
totally. And she's drawing his motions. There's ancient arts of reading people, affirming or shifting away from your accuracy or inaccuracy. And I love that you went through that. So she said it's an old man, and he said, and Saul, and it didn't say, and Saul saw it. Two different words. Like it says, I saw God ascending, and that bottom verse, and Saul perceived that it was Samuel. Because I see this form. Oh, is it Samuel? And Saul didn't see it, but we often believe, oh, Saul saw this spirit entity, but he
And of
didn't.
course, Saul went to go find someone who could see a vision of Samuel, and that's the one he just also happened to see. Like it's exactly it.
Exactly it. And because there's such a huge distance, and you'll have to remind me of the time frame of when this would have taken place, when this story occurred exactly, how it was 2,800 years ago, or is it more than that? Sorry, I'm a little foggy on that.
Well, that's a good test because we're talking about Saul, and that was after Moses, then, right?
That's
So
right.
we're talking about 1500 with Moses, and if we rock that forward to the first couple king, because we're going to the first king, right? So
Yeah,
couple hundred years after. So, I'm just estimating, I'm
yeah.
not going to say, but we're probably 13 or 1200 BC at least, right?
Perfect. And what an interesting time that was, where I like that you brought relationships in. There have been so much intermarrying in races, ethnicities, religions, and cultures that people all across all kingdoms were familiar with this behavior. It had infiltrated. Why? Because humans were finding ways to bring themselves comfort. And when we do, we sometimes obliterate reason. And here, Saul was actually stuck. He couldn't do anything but believe and what he was looking for. We will see what we're looking for in these situations. So he bowed himself to the ground. Like he's as if he's, oh my goodness, thank you, Samuel, for coming up to see me. He was so delighted. And we could have recapped the whole thing with what you just said. We have a few more pieces I want to go through. I just want to pause and get a recap. What's gone on so far in Saul's adventure? So witches were banned from the land before this occurrence, 12, 1300 years ago. They've been banned for many,
Well, yeah,
many
12,
decades.
1300 years before Christ.
Yeah, sorry, before Christ. Okay, and then Samuel died. Everybody mourned. So it was well known the prophet was dead, Saul's prophet. And then Saul fears an upcoming war with the Philistines. He decided to consult an obe, put on a disguise, and then he went to meet the woman medium. Okay, everything's good. He's really done nothing wrong so far. Here's where it goes south. She recognizes him and plays that into her drama, her theatrics, pretends she doesn't. And Saul kind of says, I need you to contact someone important to me. It's Samuel. The psychic sees this one. How desperate is this king? Very, very desperate. Saul, if we go to the end of Saul's story, he ends up killing himself. That's how desperate he was about losing his power in his kingdom. So, what does a good psychic familiar spirit obe do? They get theatrical and they shriek, pretending they now recognize Saul, and they put on a great just called up the dead performance. Like that would be a good thing for game night at your home, Dallas. We're gonna have a just call up the dead game night performance. Um, who would you call up? And Saul asks her. So remember, you just pointed it out. He asks her what she sees. She describes it's an old cloak wearing man, and everybody knew that's what a prophet looks like. So Saul is anxious and he says, "Oh, that's got to be Samuel." What does he say? And then the O puts together the story as if Samuel himself were there talking to Saul. The O, the ventriloquist, the familiar spirit lady, the psychic, all of them are the same thing in this instance, does a great performance, and Saul buys it. How can we not see that Saul fell to the power of suggestion, not the power of Satan or God? Saul asks her what she sees, and what happens? He sees it too.
I'll be honest. When you started with this, I was completely 100% open-minded to see how you were going to put some kind of coherency to it or some kind of idea to it. There was no way that I would have ever have just read that. right? Like that's so awesome how you did that. That was very well done because I now have a picture in my head. I'm not going to sit here and say I agree or disagree with it yet because being the first time hearing that information. But what I can say is it's not ringing untrue. And in fact, it reflects a lot of life that I've come in contact with. It also
Yeah.
makes sense later on in other places in the Bible. So there's a lot of confirming things where they're just firing off within me as an initial reaction. I also really enjoy how imagematic, however that word is, that scenario is. Like it's not really like if you read the law is very technical, it's very boring. That is a very dramatic sequence that we're in. The language is very storyish, so it is flared, right? Like we want to see that as a flared event, even. So there's a lot of stuff that's just jumping out that I've never looked at with this perspective. So initially, I don't want to disagree with it. That's good. I can't initially think of anything to disagree with it. I'm trying to think of what people might say
Yes,
beyond that.
let's do that for a
So
few moments.
what have you met with reservations as I'm pushing through? I'm trying to come up with reservations rather, as what have you contacted with?
Yeah, this is a real interesting one when people get a chance to dig into this because the reservations start to dissolve away, and I've rarely encountered it's similar to, oh, I'm gonna have to think about that. And I have to say I've not had anyone return with, well, okay, but what about this inside of that? And then they go, what happens is we go to another, well, what about story? And then usually we'll share this one. Oh, well, what about when the swine got filled with demons? That's okay. So instead of digesting this and exploring, is it possible that because there's only one God and no second supernatural entity that can do godlike things such as raise dead spirits, and even Samuel, if Samuel were a literal spirit that came up from the ground and had some kind of visible form as we see in that image, that would make Samuel a second God. That would make Samuel immortal in some sense. That would make Samuel having knowledge from the grave. I'm going to bounce back here if I can find that passage on knowledge from the grave. Sorry, that isn't it either. I might ruin things by trying to bounce back. Yeah, that wasn't where I needed to go, but I apologize. But that makes Samuel now in a contrary position to what the biblical idea of somebody dead is. They have no knowledge. There's no memory. They don't retain memory while they're in the grave. And the fact is, if there is a contrary view of this now, what we've shared today, and I'm not saying I'm 100% right. I have room to shift some of these views, and I continue to try to learn so I can. But we made Samuel a god by being able to show up as a spirit entity. We made Saul idolatrous by him believing in it. And of course, the witch of Endor is the one with the familiar spirit. We've seen how the Old Testament and New Testament speaks against the Ob being something to seek.
We also see how that's anti-Hebrew because as far as the perspective is, if we just familiarize ourselves again with the nations surrounding them, their natural view of the world was you get more powerful when you die. The pharaoh dies and becomes a god.
Yes.
The people die, and if they're rich and powerful, they can elevate themselves into some sort of exaltation, into some kind of divine, demigod, maybe not all the way to godhood. If they're really bad and poor in the lower caste, they'll go down into the depths. So there's so many of these ideas, but the whole idea of when I die, I can become better. That is a pagan idea. It's not really a biblical construct, but it is an ancient Near Eastern mindset.
That is great piece to add in that we actually get more strength and power when we're dead. There's nowhere in the Hebraic biblical concept or model that occurs. It's only when our Hebraic people were either enmeshed with ancient Near Eastern nations that had those beliefs, or forced to go into those ancient Near Eastern nations and then assimilated those beliefs, and then syncretization occurred where their beliefs became blended. And it's the sad divorce from Hebraic understanding of the ancient knowledge of Scripture that brought us to where we are. And in volume 3, Who's the Devil Jesus Know, there's a chapter on there Demons, a Greek a gift to Christianity, and it explains how that step happens. That we now, okay, this is how we got demons in our belief system.
Well, it's neat too, in how we see the transition of the perspective that we have to step into, because like even just looking at like the perspective of eternal life, it was not a sense of I'm going to die and go and be with God off somewhere, as you said. It was the king before me died and passed his seed to the king I now have. If the king I now have dies and passes his seed and that king rises up, that's eternal life. That's the king under the God running the system properly before, during, and after, and for all times. That's eternal life. As long
Yeah,
as that kingdom remained, that was eternal life. Why? Because the people living in that kingdom could remain.
perfect. That's
So,
so
for,
accurate, because Saul became the version of a king that the kingdom wasn't about the kingdom future to him, it was about his future to him. And that's why he misstepped so regularly. But I love the covenant theology that talks about it's always about restoring, regaining, or continuing the kingdom.
I really want to appreciate and thank you so much for taking this time, because like I'll be honest, I just like you, we all get to these questions, we all have to face these things, and there is nothing online that comes close to even making sensibilities. But I don't think you just made sensibilities of this issue. You got a rather intellectually, socially, culturally established, yeah, that does make sense to it. There's a clarity of to the understanding. It's not just another theory. It makes it sound and I don't want to make it sound like you're twisting it into making it sound like something, where what it feels more like is you're taking the stuff off that I used to prevent myself from being able to see it. So in that way, I find that to be for me personally, very beneficial. And if nobody else comments on this video, I just want to say personally, thank you so much for taking the time with me, because I think you've definitely not only set my feet on the ground running, but I already feel like, again, I'm still sitting here and I can't come up with anything. That's not normal for me. I can usually poke holes pretty easy into things, and I can't. In fact, every time I come up with something else in my head, I'm like, darn it, that confirms it. So again, I want to really thank you. But before I kick you off here, I'm going to bring you up to, plug these books, maybe that website again. And we're going to try and put another link down below. The other one did expire. We're not, and James will say, just as I am, we're not these computer geeky enough to know how to keep this going. So we'll put another link up, and hopefully that'll do what it does.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't know there was an expiry. I have learned how to turn off the expiry on some of those cloud shares, so I'll do that and get you the appropriate link if the one you have isn't working.
And for those of watching, what I'll do is once I get that, we'll put it underneath the video. Once I get that, I'll post it up for you. So go ahead, James, if you want to let people know the full scoop, because I think you represented yourself well. And if someone hasn't gone through this data, why they really should. So go for it, James.
Well, thanks, Dallas, and thank you for having me, and thank you to your audience for taking time to listen and explore. Feel free to send me an email at jrbrayshaw@shaw.ca. You can go get the 4-volume set of these books in hard copies on imaginalsatan.com or on Amazon, and Dallas will have that link for you to click on. But this is what we went through today is from Imagine No Satan. It's volume 2, and the first 4 chapters cover in great detail the hours worth of content we covered in cursory detail here to show you how we get to these conclusions. And if you download any of them to read, just go take that and read those 4, because it might be more reading than you're inclined to do until you get on your summer reading schedule, which is a number of months away. Thanks so much, Dallas, and everyone.
I just want to say again, thank you so much. James has been already grateful enough to say we'll come back and tackle the swine some other day, because again, that's the big number 2, and you did so well with this one. I would be hard pressed to not, push back on you and say you have to come. I'm not going to let you say whether or not you will. You have to come back. So we'll set that up in the future. And for the rest of you who've viewed on and joined on, thank you so much for taking this time. And we look forward to the next one. And wherever you are, I hope this finds you well, and God